Well, it goes without saying, the fourth video in this retrospective covered a watershed moment for the RE series, and good or bad, would define what it meant to make a Resident Evil game from then on. At this point, Capcom was sure to copy the award-winning format that essentially rebooted RE, but the real question was, could they repackage the RE4 experience without the assistance of series godfather Shinji Mikami? Was it possible to walk the thin line between recreating 4's paradigm-changing success and avoiding a derivative cookie-cutter clone? Well, today we sit down with an oddly controversial entry in what became the post-survival horror period in the timeline, a game that still manages to divide the fanbase today for a diverse assortment of reasons, some deserved and others not so much. What's up guys, I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews. Welcome to part 5 of the Resident Evil Retrospective. There's no doubt that Mikami's retooling of the Resident Evil format worked out pretty damn well for Capcom, so when late 2006 rolled around, the rumors that the next RE game would feature a similar gameplay style had no one picking up their jaws off the ground. What did remain a mystery was whether or not Capcom could deliver an experience on par with the last number game in the series. Development for Part 5 went relatively smoothly for a while, lacking the train wreck level disasters that the series had been known for right from the start, or at least it seemed that way. During development, it was decided there were going to be two major differences between 5 and the other entries that came before it. First and most importantly, it was decided that Chris would have a partner by his side for this adventure, and even though this was a relatively unpopular idea, somehow it made it to the finished product. The second change involved when the game would take place, and I'm not talking about what place on the RE timeline. Unlike almost every single game in the series, 5 was going to take place mostly during the day. A well-lit environment would spell out the opposite of scary in most horror projects, but the game's setting of Africa meant daylight scares were much more of a viability. Also entering the decision-making process was Capcom's use of the latest MT framework engine revision, which allowed for stark contrast levels and post-processing effects when moving from the dimly lit interior areas to the blinding hazy outdoor segments. But as the sun is almost guaranteed to rise, Resident Evil games are almost guaranteed to hit one roadblock or another during their development cycles. When 2007 hit, the game suffered some of the most ridiculous backlash in recent gaming history.
As if I need to explain myself to you.
The accusations of racial insensitivity and outright bigotry hurled at Capcom after the first showing of their reveal trailer for 5 took the company and most of the internet by complete surprise. After all, this was that wonderful few moments before words like racist, sexist, and transphobic were included in every piece of games media as decreed by law. And sadly, we do have to cover this insanity, and I want to warn you guys right up front, this is not going to be a neutral perspective on the matter. I know some of you are used to me taking a more hands-off approach in an attempt at not coming down on one side or the other too strongly. But when it comes to a situation as cut and dry as this, well, the kid gloves are coming off. But if a quick rant on social politics and games media is understandably not your idea of a good time, go to the timestamp on screen to skip to the good stuff. Trust me, you're probably better off. Now, I was initially planning on going in-depth with the history of these allegations, but to be honest, this shit goes beyond absurd and doesn't really warrant the effort. The quick and dirty version is not long after the 2007 reveal of RE5's trailer, it was already being condemned as being racist. The origin of most of these accusations point to N-Guy Kroll, a writer at Newsweek at the time. During an interview, Kroll deemed the game racially offensive, albeit in not so many words. The crux of his argument was the fact that Chris was white and the Plagas-infected enemies were native Africans. The fact that a horror game had the balls to be set in a country filled with non-white people didn't sit well with Kroll, and this was further compounded by the game's protagonist being Chris Redfield, you know, a white guy. Okay, so in the interest of cutting straight to the point, I'm gonna come right out and say this is an ignorant opinion based on a little too many personal hang-ups and far too little knowledge about Resident Evil, or, like, the real fucking world. I know I may sound unreasonable, but I absolutely refuse to entertain the idea that certain people are not allowed to interact due to racial stigma, and honestly, I pity anyone who thinks they live in a world where that's okay. If RE5 is indeed racist to you, then I assume you had a similar reaction to Leon gunning down Spanish people by the hundred in Part 4, or when Clementine of Telltale's Walking Dead series kills zombies in the predominantly white Bible Belt. But don't you worry, Kroll was prepared for just such a situation, and his response is an infantile, "It's not the same thing." To which I can only draw attention to the Spanish-American War, the Cuban fight for independence, or any other situation where white and brown people interacted negatively. If these are not entirely equally racist or equally not racist, you are at best intellectually inconsistent, and at worst, an ass no one should be listening to in the first place. Continuing his interview, Kroll also showed a complete lack of situational awareness by stating that it was clear no black people worked on the game, and I guess all I can say is, well, duh. The game was made in a country that's 97% Japanese. I would be surprised if any non-Japanese people at all worked on it. Comments like these are peppered in the original interview, and if you want to read them, I'll be linking it in the description. Now, I know I've already shown my hand, but I also want to let you guys know that this is not a subjective position. Regardless of your feelings on the matter, the definition of racism remains consistent, and until someone can supply me with a piece of dialogue where Chris comments on how he's killing these walking corpses on account of their skin color alone, I will not budge. Now, in the spirit of fairness, I do have to admit, Kroll's comments were damn near neutral when compared to what the general narrative became after the mainstream gaming press spun it, and reading through the interview again while writing this, it's clear his aim wasn't to incite a mob. If I come off strong on this matter, it's because this is a subject that means a great deal to me. Racism deserves nothing less than to be confronted where it exists, but I absolutely refuse to take part in a personal crusade to imagine it where it doesn't. Okay, now that the serious stuff is done with, let's talk about bioterrorism and mutants with exploding heads. RE5 takes place a decade after Part 4 and sees series veteran Chris Redfield joining a bioterrorism task force along with Jill, the Sandwich Valentine. After tracking down the remnants of the Umbrella Corporation and having a pretty badass fistfight with Albert Wesker, Jill sacrifices herself and Chris is assigned to an operation with the aim of keeping Ricardo Irving from selling an unknown BOW in the African black market. The game begins with Chris's arrival on the continent and him meeting his African liaison, Sheva Alomar. Right off the bat, shit turns a familiar shade of red, and from this point on, 5 makes it very clear that it is going for a much darker tone than its predecessor. The perceived tongue-in-cheek attitude of the 4th game is completely gone, replaced with a story and setting that actually takes itself damn seriously. After finding out Africa is the newest home for the Plagas parasite, Chris and Sheva play a little cat and mouse with Irving and discover Jill might not be as dead as we thought. From here, the two unravel a web of bioweapon trading intrigue and run into a few familiar faces. At this point, I realize comparisons to RE4 might start getting annoying, but since the game not only precedes 4, but also does everything it can to emulate it, I'm really forced to grade accordingly. And as far as that scale goes, 5 has a much better story in my opinion. The darker, more serious tone helps lend a little believability, boulder punching aside. Chris and Sheva are played straight and the drama between them feels authentic, at least compared to, are you a bad enough dude to save the president's daughter? I will say that Sheva's devotion to Chris can seem a little strong for someone she met like 24 hours ago, but it's good that an RE game is actually taking itself serious again. The complaints that 5 is a carbon copy of 4 may very well be warranted in other aspects of the game, but as far as structure and story goes, this is its own unique experience and I was actually pretty surprised at how much I enjoyed it. Solving my biggest complaint with 4's story, Part 5 feels like a Resident Evil tale right from the beginning. The ties to the rest of the series are strong, and the general feel is that of a legitimate RE game, and I think this is due to Shinji Mikami having nothing to do with the development. Although some may count this as a downside, the result is a story that isn't afraid to be a Resident Evil story. In 4, I felt like I was playing through something dressed up as an RE game, but 5 takes off the kid gloves and takes the series back to what it's all about. Horrific environments, bioterrorism, government corporate espionage, and of course, the Umbrella Corporation. It's all back, and I have to say it's a pleasure to jump back into this world. If you've enjoyed the tales told in previous RE games, you're likely to be right at home with 5. But if you're craving a continuation of 4's attempt at thumbing its nose at the rest of the series, well, this might not be the entry for you. Like I said from the start, Capcom would have to be equal parts crazy and afraid of money not to follow up Part 4's success. The result is essentially Super Ultra RE4 Arcade Edition. So, okay, I might be glossing over some deep improvements, so let's take this from the top. 5 puts us back in the familiar third-person over-the-shoulder view, and aiming a weapon still locks us in place. QuickTime events still play a big role in the game and make sure you can't rest during cutscenes. Honestly, at this point, I would totally forgive you for assuming this is a carbon copy of RE4's design docs, since on the surface, that's exactly what it is. But there are some nuanced changes here that make for a more enjoyable experience, in my opinion. At first, I was under the impression not much had been altered, but the more intense combat got, the more I started to notice how much more fun I was having. One of my chief complaints with 4 was how formulaic it was shooting an enemy in the face, kicking them to the ground, pulling out a knife, and slashing them till they died. This same routine repeated itself so many times that I actively had to keep from doing it in order to introduce some life into the combat. Well, at first 5 suffered from the same issue, but after the first few encounters with the typical Plagas enemies, I noticed their numbers were growing. With the large groups I was taking on, a quick headshot and melee attack meant running into a gang of baddies, and I was taking damage more often than not. At this point, gaining distance and relying more on my guns became the winning strategy. Now, this could have totally been a conscious effort from the devs, realizing they had a couple of problems to solve, or it could have been thanks to another major change, the addition of a constant partner. Having Sheva around means the ability to throw a lot more lead at enemies, which may have led to the increase in mobs. Sheva can also deliver melee attacks when I stagger enemies nearer, and we're both able to save each other when an enemy latches on. This group dynamic, while bringing the horror atmosphere down a good amount, actually works really well for the action. When I first read about this mechanic, I really didn't like the idea. I guess I could go on a rant here about how RE games are supposed to isolate and terrify the player, but instead I'll just point to any entry in this retrospective and assume I've already done it there. And besides that, Sheva definitely pulls more than her fair share of weight. If you keep her well armed, she will dole out the pain in a surprisingly smart way. Her AI always seems to know which enemies to target, and she stays relatively out of harm's way when possible. Of course, trusting Capcom's programming skills isn't the only option. Co-op multiplayer is possible in both local and online flavors, and most people swear that this is the best way to play the game. Now, I may be a jaded old curmudgeon, but I still prefer my action games single player. Plus, I like being able to force my partner to trade items instead of arguing with a real person about how they don't really need that handgun ammo anyways. Which leads us straight into the inventory system. Instead of 4's expandable grid-based deal, 5 gives each character a measly 9 slots to fill, which means playing the old item shuffle, a dance that RE fans know very well. If she has healing items, Sheva will make sure you stay at peak performance, and I freed up a lot of space by having her keep all the herbs and had her serve as my dedicated healer. QuickTime events have made a triumphant return, and I still think that they are, well, pretty okay. Like I said in my review of 4, I really wish there was a way to accomplish these things without big, bright, colorful button cues on screen, but what are you gonna do? There's still gameplay sections that help break up the flow with button mashing or turret sections. Now, these may be cliche, but it's hard to deny how much they help refresh the experience. And in the interest of not being strung up by the internet as a whole for saying that there are parts of 4 that 5 slightly improves on, let's talk about some definite downgrades. The first thing that caught my attention was how compartmentalized the game feels. On paper, 5 and 4 have just about the same design. Plop the player into a terrible place and let them shoot bad guys, solve puzzles, and find the exit. But 5 feels so much more sectioned off. It feels like each area is finished in a much shorter amount of time, although I can't really back that up with any hard facts. Going back and looking at the footage, everything seems normal, but during gameplay it feels like each area is just a little too small. Another thing I noticed, which is thankfully a little more objectively verifiable, is the absence of a merchant character to sell you your weapons and upgrades. I mean, they're still here, but they're accessed at the beginning of each level, which takes away a lot of the character of the whole ordeal. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not obsessed with a guy like most people on YouTube are, but he had his place, and it was a convenient way to alter your arsenal mid-level. And since I complimented the game's combat, it's only fair that I slam it too. These dog enemies are fucking terrible. They take a ridiculous amount of shotgun rounds to take down, and they move faster than you can actually aim. This leads to them dashing out of your line of sight just when you've drawn a bead on them, which leads to me getting really pissed off. And if I'm being honest, those 3 things are my only real complaints. Overall, Resident Evil 5 was a very positive experience, and all things considered, this is a definite upgrade from the admittedly great gameplay seen in Part 4. Even though 5 has only really made tiny improvements, it's always nice to see Capcom make a sequel to a game without tearing its foundation down in the process. And yes, I know this entire segment has been an exercise in comparing these two games, but let's be fair, that's exactly how Capcom wanted it. Which leads to a really interesting question. Why do people hate this game so much? Online, there seems to be no shortage of people slamming it, and for the life of me, I can't figure out why. I mean, it's literally everything fans loved in 4, only incrementally better. And I would know, I just played both 4 and 5 back to back. The good news is this isn't a rhetorical question, I'm actually interested to know. Is it the partner mechanic, the story, the setting? Let me know why you dislike the game down in the comments, or whether or not you even do. I will say that I came into this a little surprised. After I played it at launch, I never really picked it back up again and sort of forgot about the game altogether. Now that it seems to be a pretty popular contender in everyone's worst Resident Evil games lists, I kinda just assumed they were all right about the matter. Well, I'm glad to admit I was completely wrong. As far as gameplay goes, RE5 mirrors what made 4 great. The tight third-person shooting, action-packed set pieces, minigames, collectibles, item management, they're all here. In my opinion, this is one of the most underrated games I've come across so far in the retrospective, and just might deserve that second playthrough you've been thinking about giving it.
Dying's not so bad, but it's not gonna change anything. You're still screwed!
We're wasting time here.
Chris!
I have this really weird reoccurring issue with playing games that came out during the 360 and PS3 era. I always find myself being completely surprised at how great they look when I go back to them, so either I judged the console hardware way too harshly back in the day, or all the shit I talk about it now is actually starting to affect my memory. Either way, Resident Evil 5 is a really good looking game. The lighting tricks I talked about earlier in the video makes for some really convincing transfers from high to low light, and shadows are damn good looking, especially for the time. The textures in the environments are crazy detailed and manage to look very realistic, and since we're talking about realism, maybe it's just me, but the setting of a poor plagas-infected shantytown is just about the most terrifying location RE has done in a very long time. The first 2 hours or so had me spooked right out looking at corrugated sheet metal roofs and cramped dark alleyways with light bleeding in, but eventually the game moves to some pretty uninspired cave systems. These underground areas are fairly boring, but they eventually give way to the dilapidated Umbrella Labs we're all used to. Character models are crazy detailed, and the motion capture work makes the animations look natural as hell. During cutscenes, I noticed a pretty big emphasis on facial animations, which works most of the time, but every once in a while I notice my character suffering from robot face. Now here's where we tackle the big issue. I know most of the internet always gives Capcom shit for turning Chris into a competing bodybuilder in between 1 and 4, but I don't know, that kinda makes sense to me. I mean, if I was joining some type of anti-bioterror force, I would probably hit the gym too. Besides, that's not the worst thing going on here. Oh yeah, there's something way worse. Trust me when I say the human tricep does not look like this. Triceps aside, Plagas enemies look insanely creepy, and their look changes depending on where you encounter them. The other bioweapons you'll encounter are similarly scary, but there's one that hits a little too close to home. Are you guys seeing this pants-pissing sight? Guys, listen, I'm from South Florida, and down here, this isn't some kind of escapist fantasy, this is my fucking commute to work. All the footage you've been looking at has come from the 360 version of the game, which only outputs a 720p picture at 30 frames per second. The good news is the game actually performs really well within these parameters. Instead of allowing for slowdown, you'll actually see the game dynamically switch the VSync off. This helps keep a relatively consistent speed at the cost of some occasional screen tearing. Typically this would annoy the hell out of me, but you'll rarely notice it, and most of the time it's only in cutscenes. I may be a complete dork, but this is really interesting to me, and I don't think I've ever seen it done in a video game before, so that's always nice. Well guys, I think we both know this wasn't going to be where I stopped. Oh yeah, it's time for my favorite part of these videos, comparing the ports. Of which RE5 had a pretty good number, but most of them are multi-platform releases and fairly similar to each other. I assume you guys want to hear me talk about the original PC port, but aside from a slightly higher resolution and some graphics controls, there isn't too much to talk about. The real improvements come from the current gen re-releases. We're looking at the PS4 version right now, but you can expect relatively similar results from the Xbox One. Oddly enough, there wasn't a remastered release to coincide on the PC, so we're looking at a console-only remaster. That's kinda cool. As you can probably see, this isn't a simple up-res. Capcom has added a much better form of anti-aliasing, and some elements have been overhauled. For example, the shadows are now razor sharp, which, if I'm being honest, looks kinda odd. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but shadows need a little softness to them. Now you guys know I'm the first to admit higher resolution graphics are always nice, but the big upgrade here is the switch to 60 frames per second. As I said in my video on RE0, the jump from 30 to 60 FPS isn't as important when you're dealing with fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds, but action-packed, reflex-oriented games like 5 benefit immensely from it. If I slow the footage down here, you'll notice how smooth the camera moves, and without the need for screen-smearing motion blur. As you can imagine, in tense situations where quick reactions are needed, this boost is a godsend, and for that reason, this is the version I recommend if you're thinking about jumping in. The boost in graphics, frame rate, and the inclusion of the Lost Nightmares DLC all makes this the definitive version of the game. But who cares about the most playable version? The real question is, should it even be played at all? And I say, hell yes. Resident Evil 5 is Resident Evil 4, but better. And I know I just ruptured a few veins, but yeah, I stand by that statement. The gameplay is just as ridiculous and keeps you right on the edge of your seat. The story is what RE4 could have been if someone who liked the RE universe would have worked on it, and the dark, nasty feel the series is known for is back in full effect. Yeah guys, if you're surprised, well, I'm right here with you. I thought I was going to come out of this annoyed and tired of Resident Evil, but my experience has been just the opposite. And I even went the whole video without making more than 3 boulder punching jokes, and no, that one doesn't count. But in all seriousness, I highly recommend this one, especially if you're a fan of the older survival horror games. No, this won't scratch that pre-rendered itch, but I assume the story will be more than familiar enough to warrant a play. And if you've avoided 5 due to some negative reviews, I say give it a look. It certainly changed my mind. Thanks for sticking around guys, and make sure to stay tuned since next time we're covering a notorious black sheep of the family, right here on the Resident Evil Retrospective. Hey guys, sorry for the long wait on this one. Unless you weren't waiting, and then I take it back. If you're looking for more survival horror, I have a playlist of the retrospective right here, and if you want to support more content just like this, maybe check out my Patreon page and be a part of the incredible group that makes this all possible. Thanks a lot guys.